Video. Hi, it's Marcy Hepke from Silver Springs Pony Club. We're going to talk about nutrition tonight. This is a sea-level preparation for quiz practice. So try to get rid of these guys. Water is one of the most important nutrients, obviously, that a horse has. We need to have the constant clean water available for the horse all the time. The horse will drink more than 12 gallons per day from a running stream or a stock tank, preferably not a stagnant pond. So horses can't get enough water from eating snow, and it actually covers up their hay or their grass out in the pasture, so they can't get to that either. You can also put goldfish in your horse tanks to reduce mosquito eggs and keep the tank clean. Minerals and supplement feeding. Salt should be available free choice for the horses, either in a block or loose. In the summertime, when the horses are losing a lot of salt through sweat, it's super important to have the salt available loose to the horse so they can get as much as they want without having to lick it up. If a horse can't get enough minerals and supplements to meet nutrition needs from their pasture, we'll have to incorporate some grain, hay, or potentially both. So some of the reasons that pastures will lack good nutritional grass is the pasture might be too small, it might have too many weeds, might be overgrazed by having too many horses out there. If that happens, then the grass obviously stops growing and the weeds come in. You could also have a drought, or like we talked about, being snow covered, kind of like today. So there's different methods of feeding the hay. You can use a hay feeder, ground feeding. The drawbacks are feeding the hay on the ground would be that they could waste quite a lot of hay. The horses also might pick up sand and possibly get sand colic. They might also ingest parasite eggs. So this, by the way, is all directly from the D manual, or excuse me, the C manual. And then I have a more in-depth version of that goes a lot more in depth with some of this nutrition stuff out of the actual HBA manual. So back to feeding hay. So you want to put the hay 30 feet apart, away from gates, fences, and corners, with 1 to 2 extra piles so the horses don't fight or get injured. So this horse in the picture here is pretty thin. So a horse might need supplemental nutrition if they're out on pasture, if the grass or hay is not very valuable nutritionally. The horse gets ridden a lot or shown, or the horse is thin starting out. They would need some grass or some grain included in their hay or grass. So horses are grazers, and they're designed to live on grass, hay, and other plants, small amounts almost constantly. So they should be grazing or eating almost all the time. Horses' stomachs produce acid 18 to 20 hours a day. And so if there isn't small amounts of hay or grass to graze on, the horse could potentially get some ulcers. So the horses are usually moving freely to graze to be able to find hay or grass all the time. Obviously, water is another thing horses are designed to live on. And so horses need all basic types of nutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. And the most important one is water. Feeding, water, and nutrition. We're going to talk about a little bit about digestion. There's a process for breaking down food for absorption, and that helps the food be utilized by the horse's body. So it takes about 3 days from the time the horse eats for that food to be completely digested throughout their body. Digestion can be affected by excitement if the horse is excited or nervous or has been exercised recently. So You don't want to feed a hot horse or feed a horse right after they've been exercised. All the blood is currently pumping through their muscles, their lungs. It's in recovery and repair mode. And so feeding them after that time could cause the digestive tract to not work at its most efficient. How to feed horses. Horses eat really slowly. It takes them about 10 to 15 to 20 minutes rather to eat a pound of hay and 10 to 15 minutes to eat a pound of grain. So if they eat their food too fast and choke, the eating too fast is called bolting their food and could lead to choking. You can slow a horse's eating down by feeding small amounts of grain a little bit more often, feeding hay first so he's not hungry. Spread the feed out in a really large feeder, like a feed bunk, and that helps them pick up smaller pieces and kind of have to graze for their food. You can also put large smooth stones about the size of a softball in their feed bucket, and that helps them they have to eat around the stones in order to slow their feed consumption. Obviously, fresh water at all times is very important. The hay is the cheapest source of energy that should make up most of the horse's diet, so hay and or pasture. So a roughage made of dried grass and plants is essentially the definition of hay. It's a substitute for the grass your horse would eat out in the pasture. So if you have good quality hay, it's going to provide bulk, which fills the horse's gut, energy through carbohydrates, protein, vitamins, minerals, and fiber. It's very necessary for good digestion. A horse will need to eat grass or hay pretty much all day to be their healthiest. So the different types of hay: grass hay, legume hay, and oat hay. So grass hay has more fiber and is less concentrated, meaning it's not quite as nutritious, but it's still healthy for the horse. Some examples of grass hay are timothy, brome, orchard grass, rye, prairie hay, coastal Bermuda, and others. Legume hay, actually, you can know the difference between legume hay and grass hay because the legume hay produces seeds in a pod. The legume hay also takes in nitrogen from the air and processes it through the plant. And actually, in the roots of the legume, there's what's called nitrogen fixating nodules that actually put nitrogen back in the soil. And so, for instance, examples of legumes are alfalfa, clover, and lucerne. But another legume actually is soybeans because they have nitrogen fixating nodules. And if you think of soybeans or edamame, that type of thing, they produce seeds in a pod. And so the reason we talk about this nitrogen being taken from the air and processed into the roots of the plant and putting it back into the soil is important. That's why we do crop rotation in farming for corn and soybeans, that you can rotate back and forth. And if you put soybeans in the ground, you have to apply less nitrogen to your corn the next year. So you're using the plant to help you. So the legume hay also produces protein from that nitrogen that's taken in from the air. So legumes are greater than grass in protein, calcium, and vitamins. And so they're a little bit more rich, if you will. The oat hay, I've never seen it fed. Don't know anyone who does feed it in our area. I'm sure it's fed other places. It contains the oat stalk, or like you might see a wheat. Wheat is kind of like oats, but different. So the stem or the stalk, and then some of the oats or the grain. So you can see here the feed pyramid. Forage is your biggest block here, that you want your horse to have grass or hay, and then you can add grain if needed and supplements on top of that if needed. So there's a difference between high quality hay and low quality hay. And it's super important. There's so many people that feed poor quality hay and have to pay so much money to feed extra concentrates or grains to make up for the quality of the hay. So your high quality hay is obviously going to be a lot better in nutrition, and it's green, leafy, fine stems, and it smells sweet. And most of those qualities come from the hay being cut a little bit earlier in the, maybe not in the season, but cut early before the actual plant matures and becomes tough or loses its leaves. Obviously, we get several cuttings a year. And actually, the earlier cuttings of the year can be a little tougher than later cuttings that tend to be a little finer stemmed. So the low quality hay, if you cut it too late, the stems are very coarse, woody, a lot fewer leaves, meaning the leaves will kind of fall off as the plant matures. It also loses a little bit of nutrition. So this isn't necessarily a terrible thing. Like, it's not a make or break because it's not moldy or musty at this point. So you could feed a horse that's a super easy keeper, could use a lot lower quality hay that's just kind of standing in the pasture biding their time, versus if you have an athlete, you want to feed a little bit more of the high quality hay. Clearly never feed hay that's moldy or musty. If it has white chunks in it or it sticks together, that's usually mold and must. Sometimes it can be confused with dusty hay. Dusty hay can come from just baling it really dry and having a lot of dust in the hay as you're preparing it, but either can cause issues. Obviously, mold and musty is terrible. We would never want to do that. That could cause a horse to have colic. But the dusty hay could cause respiratory issues in your horse. So if your hay is dusty but not moldy, it would be acceptable to take that hay and dip it in the water, wet it down, get the dust settled, and you could still feed it. Again, as long as it's not mold dust. Hay cubes are, these are different ways to process hay other than a bale of hay. So we have hay cubes, basically, which is chopped hay pressed into cubes. You've all seen them. They're small. We actually use them for treats for our horses instead of horse treats. Has a little less sugar, a little more nutrients. You can have alfalfa hay cubes, Timothy hay cubes, or a mix. You can feed them wet or soaked. I know people who do it both ways. We don't soak them. Obviously, we feed them as treats. But if I fed quite a lot, I might go ahead and soak them. So hay cubes are really nice to have around because they're super easy to store and they last a while because it's low moisture. If the hay is scarce, meaning the hay didn't get baled because it was too wet for whatever reason, if there's not much hay around, you can use cubes. It's also very easy to chew because it's been chopped already. It's low in dust. As I mentioned, longer shelf life because of the low moisture. So the disadvantages of using hay cubes, it's a little bit more money, and the horses eat a little more quickly and become bored. So we have a couple more ways to process hay here. Chaff and chopped hay, which are pretty much the same, except the chaff is smaller than chopped hay. The chopped hay is dried and chopped in small pieces. It comes in a 40-pound bale. They add molasses to hold the product together and keep the dust down. You always want to read the label on the package of chopped hay. We have been traveling around the country and not been able to bring enough hay with us, and we've fed chopped hay or hay cubes or even compressed hay, which is chopped hay without the molasses. Those are good options while you're on the road if you need something quick. So advantages to chopped or chaff is it's an easy way to add fiber to your horse's diet. It's easier to chew than the cubes because remember the cubes are compressed. If there's a hay shortage, again, you can feed chaff or chopped hay. It's easy to store if you keep it cool and dry, but it has a little bit less of a shelf life than cubes because of the added moisture of the molasses in the product. Disadvantages of feeding chopped hay and chaff are it's more expensive. The horses could eat their ration really quickly because it's already kind of pre-chewed for them, if you will, chopped, and they could become bored. So you may have to feed hay on top of it. Another way to process hay is something called haylage. Again, I've been around many horse farms all over the nation, and I've never seen this fed. There's probably places that do it. It is in your Pony Club book, so that's why it's mentioned here, because you may need to know this for quiz, okay? So it's a roughage or a forage, like we talked about. It's part of a hay product, or hay slash grass. It's processed by cutting it, then they let it semi-wilt. Um, they don't dry it out all the way like they do hay. Then they put it in bags or bales, and then the fermentation continues. So it's more fermented. Some things you might know that are fermented: sauerkraut, yogurt, kombucha, kimchi, different things like that. So as the fermentation continues, there's less dust and less mold spores in haylage. So that's a little bit of an advantage. This is not the same product as silage for cows. That is semi-fermented. Cows have 4 stomachs and a whole different digestive tract, so you would never feed silage to horses. So some advantages of haylage: it's good for horses with respiratory problems. 10% higher nutritional value than hay, so it is a little more nutritious. Palatable, and that means your palate is your mouth taste buds, part of your mouth, and so palatable means it tastes good to the horse. So there's less waste to feeding haylage. It's a little smaller to store than it would be regular hay, and you can store it outside because it's in bags. So the disadvantage of feeding haylage is it's a little bit more expensive. Okay, we're going to talk about some grains. Grains are also referred to as concentrates. And remember, not every horse needs grain, just hay and or grass, if it's very good quality, could be enough for most horses unless they're exercising or what have you. So grain has more nutrients per pound than hay or grass. So it has 50 to 60% more digestible energy per pound than hay. If you stop and think about what is in grains on the right-hand side, it says oats, corn, barley, bran, sweet feed. So if you look at what that horse is eating, I can't see any oats, corn, barley, bran. It has all been processed, if you will, quote unquote, pre-chewed and broken down in order for the horse to be able to access that nutrition a little bit more readily. So having 50 to 60% more DE is digestible energy per pound than hay. That's quite a lot. So you want to be very careful we don't overfeed these grains. So a healthy diet should be more than 50% roughages and forages. And if you have good quality forages, that would make up, if your horse requires 100% nutrition, that's going to make up about 85% of the total nutrition needed for the horse, and then the rest can be supplemented with grains if necessary. So you would only feed grain if the horse isn't getting enough nutrition from the grass or the hay that they're eating. So the grains can be crimped, rolled, flaked, all kinds of different forms. So let's talk about oats specifically. Here's a picture of oats and a dime, so you can see the size difference. Some of these grains look similar to each other, and so I've tried to put pictures so you can see the differences. So oats are the safest grain to feed because they're high in fiber and they're less concentrated. And when we say concentrated, that refers to the amount of nutrition that's packed into those oats. So when you choose your oats, you want to look for some that are plump, heavy kernels, and they weigh at least 32 pounds per bushel. So when you buy that at your feed store or grain elevator, you should be able to ask that question and make sure that it's at least 32 pounds or higher per bushel to make sure you're getting a good quality oat. That allows them to have plenty of starch, which is a type of sugar that helps. It's the #1 nutrient, second line nutrient that the horse uses to keep themselves healthy. Also allows that it's not too much fiber, because if the oats are real tiny and they had mostly hulls, So like wheat hulls are really bran, and that's super high in fiber. Fiber is good for horses, but in this case, we're eating the oats because we are looking for some fiber, but also the nutrients as well. So you want that balanced quite well. Corn, it's in the book. It's not one of my favorite things to feed horses. I think people fed horses similar to cows back in the day, and I don't know that that's the healthiest way to feed. I know there's some corn or processed corn in some of the grains that we feed in pellets, if you will. It has the highest energy per pound of all the grains, and you want to feed it with caution because the horse can get really fat having too much corn in their diet. A lot of times sweet feeds will have cracked corn and stuff in it, and that sometimes is a little too much starch or sugar from that corn. A lot of energy there. Obviously, don't feed moldy corn. The horse can get really, really sick from that, botulism or colic, lots of things. Different types of corn. You can feed corn on the cob, cracked corn, whole corn, rolled corn, and flaked corn. So if you look at this corn here, it has a tough outer shell, and that's one way plants protect themselves from being overeaten by animals and going extinct is a tough outer shell or putting off toxins if you eat too much that might harm the host, a person or an animal. And so if you want the most out of your corn or your oats here, you would have to run this through a crimper, have rolled oats, crimped oats, or cracked corn or rolled corn or flaked corn to really kind of pre-chew, if you will, and break open this external seed hull on the outside here. And that's going to allow the nutrients that are inside here to be absorbed and digested in the horse's digestive tract. Otherwise, it would just pass through and you would see it coming out the other end, which sometimes you will. 20% is what they say on oats, that you have 20% savings of your oats if you crimp them or roll them, that you're going to get that much extra nutrition out of them. Continuing on with grains, this is barley. And so again, it looks very much like wheat, but it's in the wheat family, but different. I think it's a little smaller. So on the bottom, this is whole barley. And at the top, this is called flaked barley. You can see where it's squished, flattened open, and you can see some of the lighter color interior of the barley coming out. And that's going to expose more nutrition to the horse's digestive tract. Doesn't take as much chewing, digestive juices, enzymes, all that to break that down. So it's barley is similar to oats. It has more energy and less fiber than oats, and less energy and more fiber than corn. So it's sort of in the middle between oats and corn. They can still overeat on it and get too much sugars, starches and energy from the barley. So again, rolled or flaked is good to get rid of the outer husk and increase digestibility, and that is the ability to digest the actual nutrients. Next up is bran. So basically this is ground up hulls of wheat. So the hull is the outside of what you saw on the oats, also on the wheat. And it's mostly mixed with other feeds. You might see it you might not know it, but it might be in your sweet feed, different things. If your horse has ever been sick, or a lot of times just after they foal, we'll give them a bran mash, which kind of helps. It's a little bit of a laxative that helps the horse pass feces a little easier. You do not want to feed this in large quantities because it's very high in phosphorus. And with equine nutrition, it's super important to maintain a good calcium to phosphorus ratio. And that can cause a lot of bone problems, particularly in young and growing horses. Very important, the type of hay that you feed to young and growing horses to make sure they develop properly and don't get epiphysitis and some of the other developmental orthopedic diseases that can plague horses. Here is an example of sweet feed, and you can see some of the little pieces in there. I see some corn, some oats again, and there's pellets that would have a little bit more of the nutritional component. There may be some bran in there as well. I see molasses, which is kind of a binder that holds together any kind of loose minerals that might be floating around so they don't settle out at the bottom of the bag. So sweet feed is mixed grain with molasses, and molasses is sugar, and sugar tastes good, so it increases the palatability. And remember, the palatability is the palate of your mouth, and so it tastes good. Again, the molasses helps keeps the dust down as well as keep all of the nutrients packed all together. So when you buy sweet feed, you don't want to buy too much ahead because it can spoil in the hot, humid weather, or if it's hot and humid in the building you're keeping it in. It also can attract flies, so you need to keep your feed pans clean. Let's talk about pelleted feeds. We have some ground up feeds pressed into pellets, and you can see in the background, this is a little bit more of a hay pellet, if you will. They look huge in this example, but they're actually normal sized. So there's 4 types of pelleted feeds. We have single ingredient, such as alfalfa meal, which would be alfalfa pellets, which I think that's what this is. Some mixed grain pellets, feed supplements. If you ever get a Smart Pack or any kind of feed supplement and you scoop it out and it's pellets, that can be all those goodies packed into one little pellet. Complete feed pellets. So a complete feed always means that you can dump that bag or feed that as a complete ration. It has the hay in it if it says complete feed. So that means it contains grain and hay. If you feed your horse something like senior feed, most senior feeds are a complete feed. So you can feed that to your horse and they're getting all the hay that they need in their diet if you're feeding the recommended daily allowance dose per your horse's weight. But if your horse sits there and eats that bucket and then doesn't have anything to eat all day or all night, they might start chewing wood. So you still might have to provide additional forage so they don't eat up your barn. Beet pulp is another type of roughage that people feed horses. It's a byproduct of processed sugar beets. So sugar can come from the beets, and then what's left, they grind this up, or they have this byproduct that they don't use. It's kind of after they've squeezed the sugar out. Now it still is higher in sugar, but it has a lot of fiber in it. So it's almost like they've juiced it, and this is what's left. So it's used as a form of roughage for horses with heaves or allergies, because normally you soak it before you feed it. Instead of hay that might be a little more dusty. And even if it's not dusty, just that dry hay sometimes is enough to set a horse off if they have some COPD or allergies. Most of the time it's shredded like you see, or pelleted. I've not seen that, but I'm sure it's out there. It is more digestible than hay, in my opinion, probably because it's already pre-chewed, and then you would have it soaked, and so you wouldn't need as much digestive juices to digest it. Bulkier than grain, so it kind of, a lot of fiber fills up the gut. The calcium content is greater than Timothy, but less than alfalfa. It's low in phosphorus and B vitamins. It contains no carotene or vitamin D. So pasture grass, this is actually one of the pastures at Triangle H. I think that's Grace's horse, Lucy. And this is in the springtime, and we had, you can see behind Lucy, there's some lines in the grass where we have, you can see where we planted it. So this is some of our cover crops, cereal rye that we plant last fall, and it was 9 foot tall. So literally we couldn't see the horses in the grass. And this was really nice because it was grass coming in before, it's a cool season grass, so it grew all winter, kind of bolts in the spring, and then it's kind of done while the rest of the pasture grasses that normally come in the spring come up. So we've got extended grazing season. So a pasture is technically an open space where horses can exercise, get fresh air, graze on the most natural food source. It's an inexpensive source of good nutrition. It does take some maintenance, though, obviously, to have good pastures. It's important for broodmares, foals, and growing horses. So they have lots of room to run and growing directly from the ground. So it's a little cheaper for you to put your horse out here and let them graze and spread their own manure than it would be to put the horse in the stall, let's say most of the day or 24 hours, and be able to then go out and burn fossil fuels. So you take your tractor out, burn fuel to mow, rake, bale, drive it to the shed, put it in, get your tractor out, go to the hay shed, get the hay bale out and put it out for the horse, and then use your tractor to clean up all the manure. So this is a very sustainable way as using pasture for your horses. So you've been to Triangle H probably and done one of our pasture walks with us and heard how we try to extend that growing season and do the sustainable practice of intensive rotational grazing and lots of other interesting concepts. So if you haven't seen that, you'll have a chance to do that in the future, I'm sure. So in the spring, obviously the grass is growing very fast. It also can be highly stressed with when you have a frost or something that stresses the grass. It causes a shooting, an increase or a spike in the sugars in the grass, which can cause lots of things that we'll talk about here in a minute. It also has a high water content early in the spring, high levels of sugar for the reasons I've mentioned and more. When the sun shines on the grass, it's undergoing photosynthesis, and that also is producing sugars. So the sugar levels of grasses are lower at night than they are during the day. Side note there. The springtime grass may upset your horse's digestion, so you need to start slowly with a half hour, increase slowly over 2 to 3 weeks. Horses with laminitis risk are small ponies, overweight horses, horses with metabolic disease. We need to limit grass by using a dry lot or a grazing muzzle. So what's in your pasture? Horses are hard on pastures, if you haven't noticed. They graze the grass off to the ground. Their horses tear up the turf. And horses won't graze where they poop. So we have to have enough area for them to spread out and let that grass regrow. This is again early spring grass in our pastures. That's when Emma was tiny. In order to produce good pasture grass, you need to seed, fertilize, soil test, and get the soil adjusted, maybe adding limestone or something to change the pH, clear out the weeds, mow your pastures no less than 4 to 6 inches. You want to keep the grass a little taller there. Don't forget to rest your pastures. Rotational grazing, as we talked about, is super important. Utilizing paddocks to rest the grass so your horses come in the paddock at night, go out during the day, or vice versa. You don't want to overgraze with too many horses out there. So what weighs more, a pound of feathers or a pound of bricks? You can say your answer out loud to yourself. You don't have to unmute. So we're talking about weighing and measuring feed. So if I have a pound of feathers and a pound of bricks, I have a pound of each and they're the same. But what do they look like? Is the pile of feathers bigger than the pile of bricks? Probably. So I thought I had a picture of that on there, but I didn't put it. So a lot of times people say my horse gets a scoop of grain, which you guys are in Pony Club, you know you don't feed just by volume, you feed by weight. So if you feed a scoop, you've already weighed what a scoop of sweet feed and a scoop of oats and a scoop of corn weighs or whatever you're feeding. So you know exactly what you're feeding. So this picture's out of your Pony Club book. And so if you have a lot of people feed with coffee cans, if you use a small coffee can, you would just take this coffee can, get a full scoop of whatever you're feeding, and then you would weigh that on a scale and see, and you can even write on there, this is a pound and a half of pellets, or this is a pound, it's a pound of sweet feed, whatever it weighs. Each feed will weigh differently. So if you fill this can full of feathers and you weigh it, it's going to weigh different than if you fill this can full of marbles. They'll weigh differently, if that makes sense. So you could use a feed scoop, a can, whatever you have. So you need to know the weight of each of the grains you're feeding and your hay. So you can, like we said, figure out the type of each grain you're feeding, what size is 1 pound, figure out how many pounds of feed each of your scoops or cans holds, label them. 1 pound of corn takes up less space than 1 pound of oats. And a pound of bran takes up a whole lot more space because it's tinier and it all fits together. Hay comes in bales between 40 and 75 pounds. So when someone says, oh, my horse gets a half a flake or half a bale of hay in the morning and half a bale of hay, or a half a bale per day, rather, the quarter in the morning, quarter at night. Well, are you feeding 20 pounds or are you feeding 37 pounds, 30 pounds, whatever you're feeding? So you need to know really what your horse's needs are. So if you have a 1,000-pound horse, they're going to eat about 22 pounds per day in total ration. And so if that bale is 50 pounds, they're probably going to eat about half that bale in a day. But you've got to do the math on your horse. If your hay changes, you need to make sure you weigh it. So you can weigh a flake or you can weigh a bale, whatever system you have to, if you have a scale big enough to weigh a bale. So you can weight tape your horse, and I recommend seasonally because your horse is probably rounder now than it would be in the middle of summer when you're riding and showing more. And so do the math then to figure out to make sure your horse is getting enough there. Horses will eat mostly roughages, and that helps their digestion stay healthy. We talked about that before, mostly hay or grass and a small amount of grain if needed. Another one of our pastures, different rations for different purposes. So the maintenance ration is for keeping the horse just as he is, not gaining or losing. Ordinary health and fitness, moderate energy and protein. If you're feeding a conditioning ration, obviously it's for developing fitness. As your work increases, so does the horse's caloric intake or needs, rather. If you have a rest day ration, when the horse has a day off, the ration should be cut to half or less. Extra hay or roughage should be fed. So 3 pounds of grass hay for every 1 pound of grain cut out. Roughing off, taking a long vacation from work, laying off, cut back gradually. If adding grazing in, start slowly. If your horse is sick, obviously you're going to talk to your vet about what they need, but you need something that's nutritious but easy to digest because your horse is spending a lot of energy trying to get well and heal parts of its body. So if you give them something that's difficult to digest, you're taking blood flow and resources away from areas that may need to be healing. So you may need to feed a little bit more of a laxative diet with bran in it, perhaps, smaller meals. But if your horse is not eating the food in their bucket, be sure you clean it out. Clean out all that uneaten food so it doesn't rot or spoil. Fresh grass, good hay, treats may improve appetite. Your horse isn't eating, you can put different things, applesauce, carrots on their feed to encourage them to eat it. And sometimes the horse needs to not eat so it can heal in a kind of a fasting kind of way. Actually, the body kind of knows what to do there. Obviously, fresh, clean water is always super important, and we need to make sure we monitor consumption, particularly on the ill horse. And if you ask your vet if they have any special feeds for your horse. So feeding schedule, this came out of your C manual, and I'm sure you've seen that before. Okay, I have a HB section here. Actually, we're going to talk a little bit more about that next time because we're almost out of time this time. And I do have a video that we're going to play here. A couple on digestion because that's what we're going to dive into next and get a little bit more in depth in the HBA section. Really dig into carbohydrates and fats and proteins and all the vitamins and minerals and kind of get those figured out. So I'm going to start this video here. If you have chat and this isn't working, let me know.
They must be.
Okay. You guys have any questions before we, let me close that. Okay. All right. Y'all have any questions before we end for tonight? And if you have anything else that you would like to hear about or study, let me know or send me a message. Okay.